The next 60 days could be the most important in the war in Ukraine since the opening days of the invasion. We're seeing both Ukraine and Russia appear to jockey for position as they await the start of the incoming Trump administration in January. It's a lot to cover, so let's get into it. Now, to kind of set the stage here, I think it's worth taking a look at a recent Financial Times article where they say that a Ukrainian army spokesperson told the Financial Times that more medical personnel were being sent to the Eastern Front in anticipation of heavy battles in the coming days and weeks, particularly in the south and east. They say, but if Ukraine is able to stop Russia's offensive and seize the initiative by the time Trump takes office on January 20th, senior Ukrainian officials believe they could prove that they are fighters and winners and help convince the president-elect to stand by them. Now, we're going to start out with some battlefield updates today, and the majority of what we're going to look at is in and around Kursk. That's the territory that Ukraine took inside of Russia a couple months ago. But I do think it's worth mentioning that Russia is continuing to advance in multiple other areas of the front. We'll pull up a map here, take a look at these. This is Deep State Map. It's a publicly available resource. It, along with all of the articles that I talk about in this video, will be linked in the description below. Now, namely, where Russia continues to advance outside of what we're going to look at in Kursk here in a moment is south of Pokrovsk. This is the area west of Avdiivka, where Russia advanced pretty quickly in recent months, and in the east up here near Kupiansk. In fact, across the front right now, the Russian pace of advance has been faster over the course of the last few weeks and months than really at any time since the opening days of the war. But that is directly translating to higher Russian losses than we've seen in quite a while. And more on that second piece here in a minute. Now, the Kursk incursion, what's going on there is really confusing, even for anybody who's been following this war or trying to follow this war as closely as possible. This is an area where you don't have really a front line dug in like you do throughout the rest of the front. You know, you're seeing a lot of trenches and bunkers built up by Ukraine and Russia at portions of the east and the south. That doesn't exist in Kursk. I mean, the Ukrainian forces have dug in to the extent possible in recent months, but it's not anywhere like what you're seeing, again, in the east and the south. So, you know, generally across the entire front, it's Russian forces advancing. But in areas of Kursk, day in and day out, we're seeing videos and reports from both sides. The Ukrainian forces and Russian forces are advancing in different places at different times. It's very confusing. But to break it down here, I've got a thread from a solid analyst named Emil Castahelmi, where he said, quote, Russia is advancing, but it's also spending significant amounts of men and material in the process. In Kursk, the Russians have renewed their attacks and are now pushing strongly, especially against the western and northern flanks of the Ukrainian-controlled Kursk salient. They likely recaptured Pogrebki, excuse my pronunciation, and Pukovo. The situation in many villages is unclear. According to our assessment, the Ukrainians now control around 500 square kilometers in Kursk. There are some uncertainties as the situation is very dynamic around many villages. However, it's very likely now that Ukraine controls less than half of the territory that it's held at its peak. So, you know, it wasn't all that long ago that Ukraine held over 1,000 square kilometers of territory inside of Kursk. Russia didn't really do much about that for a while. It does look like in recent days they've kind of started to mount the offensive to try to push Ukraine out of Russia proper. Emil continued by saying the nature of the battle in Kursk is becoming increasingly political. Russia reportedly has around 50,000 troops in the area. Ukraine has likely concentrated 20 to 30,000 troops in the general direction. These forces are now fighting over relatively insignificant peripheral countryside. The Ukrainians are in no position to seriously threaten any important logistical routes, military installations, cities, or other infrastructure. This is a bargaining chip. The Kursk incursion likely always has been, to a degree, a bargaining chip in negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. There is a bit of an argument that this was initially kicked off with the idea of pulling Russian forces from elsewhere along the front. Pretty quickly, we found out that that wasn't the case. Russia was not going to be pulling forces from areas like Pokrovsk, Kupiansk, or elsewhere, and we'll get into more of that here in a moment. Emil continues by saying the Russians have clearly stated that they will not start any negotiations until Ukraine is driven out of Kursk. This locks them into an unnecessarily rigid political position given the size and nature of the territory controlled by Ukraine. Either the Russians have calculated that they have sufficient strength and equipment for offensive operations in many directions, and that the attrition at Kursk will not cause significant hindrances in any relevant scenarios, or they are prioritizing political goals above all. I'll push back on that a little bit when he's saying that this is a relatively small piece of territory inside of Russia. I think it has outsized weight when looking at the political ramifications here. If you look at Russian media, there's a lot of civilians and military bloggers that are very upset and confused as to why Ukraine still holds territory inside of Russia. Right? This is the vaunted Russian military that the people inside of Russia are being told is advancing day in and day out, crushing the Ukrainians, crushing not just the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians with a lot of NATO backing. So it's been very difficult, in fact, in a lot of ways, ignored by Putin and the Kremlin in trying to explain away how this military that Russia is supposedly just running over is able to push into Russia itself, take, and hold territory for a couple months. So I do think Kursk is very, very important, and it's likely the reason that we're seeing kind of an increased focus there in the last few weeks by Russia. Now, a part of that, getting into the size of this force, actually pulls in the North Korean element. If you remember, a couple weeks ago, we started to hear more and more rumors of North Korean troops being utilized by Russia. And a New York Times article hit on this, where they said the Russian military has assembled a force of 50,000 soldiers, including North Korean troops, as it prepares to begin an assault aimed at reclaiming territory seized by Ukraine in the Kursk region of Russia. That's according to U.S. and Ukrainian officials. They say a new U.S. assessment concludes that Russia has massed the force without having to pull soldiers out of Ukraine's east, its main battlefield priority, allowing Moscow to press multiple fronts simultaneously. Ukrainian officials say they expect such an attack involving the North Korean troops in the coming days. That article was published on November 10th. So in the coming days could be any day now, I suppose. I should mention that we've been hearing about the North Korean troops entering the fight any day now for quite a while, and there's really no evidence to support that quite yet. There's been I think there were a couple of pictures that were fabricated with a passport. Remember that one? Photoshopped right on top. That was not real. And there's been the occasional drone footage that may show some radio intercepts that may show you North Koreans towards the front, but that hasn't yet been confirmed. But according to this article and a handful of sources right now, it seems like that very well might be in the works. Now, another note on the North Korean presence in this war, I do think it's being portrayed kind of in the wrong way, depending on who you're getting your information from. I've seen a lot of folks present this as a sign of Russian desperation. I don't think that's the case. As we're seeing here, Russia is able to, we're talking about 10, maybe 12,000 total North Korean troops that have been moved to Russia. So if you take them out of the mix, you're still talking about a 40,000 strong Russian force pushing now against the Ukrainians in Kursk. And they're able to put that together without really pulling from anywhere else along the front. In fact, Russia is advancing faster in multiple areas of the front than they have in a long time. So I don't think desperation is the right look there. I think, if anything, it points to kind of the increased military cooperation between these two countries, something that likely could continue for months, years, and keep Russia in this fight longer than anyone anticipated. But nonetheless, we do have some feedback coming from inside of Russia about these North Korean troops being there. The fact that they're there is no longer up for debate. They're certainly in Russia. It's just how they're going to be used. And there was a firearms instructor that talked about his experience in working with some of these new North Korean troops. He said there's no desertions that he's aware of. If you recall, right when this news came out, the first thing was that a bunch of them had deserted and had been captured by Ukraine. Clearly that wasn't the case, or we'd have a lot more information about that at this point. But this firearms instructor said in interacting with these North Korean troops, it sounds like all of them came on their own free will and are motivated. They want to be there. He says none of them want to desert and put their families back home at any sort of risk, which makes sense. You can see how that would be a real concern. And he says, to be honest, they're not ready to play a decisive role in assaults yet. At best, they'll be able to cover the rear, ensure security, and work in defensive roles. And he added that besides the language issue, which of course is going to be significant, he adds that there's a problem of friend or foe identification, saying that these North Korean troops so far genuinely struggle to tell Russians apart from the Ukrainians, which will be interesting. I mean, there's a couple different ways that you can go about doing that, right? We've clearly got the armband markings. There's another piece of this where it just kind of depends where they are in the battlefield, especially when you have fixed lines, right? There's certain areas where it's only Ukrainian forces operating, other areas where it's only Russian forces. But interesting that the friend or foe piece there is a note for the Russian instructor in the rear. All of this makes a lot more sense than pushing the North Koreans forward in some sort of combined assault. offensive assault operations are very, very challenging, very complex to coordinate, even when you're speaking the same language. So I wouldn't expect the North Koreans to be tied into any sort of assault force anytime soon. But again, pretty easy to put them in defensive roles, pretty easy to tie them into any sort of artillery support when they use a lot of the same systems that Russian forces do. But again, we'll have to wait and see how those North Korean soldiers are actually utilized. Now, a lot of what we're going to focus on today is the ground fight, the advances on the ground between mostly up in Kursk. But I think it's worth mentioning that another way that Russia is trying to increase the pressure on Ukraine right now is through drone strikes. So far this year, Russia was averaging around 430 drone strikes per month. These are the large, either Iranian Shahed, or when they're made in Russia, which most of these are now, they're called the Garan 2 style drone, kind of the Dorito shape looking drone. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about drone strikes, not these smaller FPV style drones at the front. So 430 per month throughout the year. Then starting in September, just a couple months ago, that tripled to 1,339. That's a big jump. And then it jumped again in October to 1,930. And already in November, not even halfway through November at this point, they're on track to be closer to 2,500 this month. They're more than a 5x increase from earlier this year. That's too big a jump to ignore, right? This is clearly a way that Russia is trying to influence control or try to influence the direction of the war going forward. And there's a couple different ways you can interpret this. It's one, trying to actually inflict damage on Ukrainian infrastructure, or two, trying to run down the Ukrainian air defense stocks with the goal of, at some point, maybe under a Trump administration coming in a few months, Ukraine won't be receiving resupply there. And some of these other Russian munitions will have an easier time getting through, and Ukraine might have to reconsider their negotiating position. Now, turning to some of the peace plans that we've seen circulating here in recent weeks, I want to start with what supposedly President Zelensky has put forward, and this was outlined in a recent Financial Times article, where they say two of the ideas laid out by Zelensky in Zelensky's victory plan had Trump specifically in mind. And I think that's worth noting, that we tend to look at all of this and think that there is a plan and that's it. And then you got to try to bring the people in to get on board with that specific plan. It makes sense here. A smart leader, a good leader, would look at the different options. And in this case, Zelensky say, we're going to have a plan for Trump and we're going to have a plan for Harris, and kind of play into what we think might be appealing to each of them. And that sounds like exactly what happened. So one of these ideas, supposedly, is that some U.S. troops in Europe would be replaced with Ukrainian forces after the war as a cost-saving measure for the United States. And something that Trump has talked about a lot is finding ways to, reduce the cost of the U.S. military providing security in portions of Europe. Pulling U.S. troops back from Europe, replacing them with Ukrainians, is one way to do that. The other, which was supposedly first designed by Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, suggests sharing Ukraine's critical natural resources with Western partners. And they say that Trump was, quote, interested in the two plans, as according to somebody who was briefed on the meeting. Separately, business leaders in Ukraine are also talking to the government about offering Trump investment screening powers, allowing him to essentially choose who can do business in the country. One person involved in the planning described the idea as ABC, anybody but China, which they think will play pretty well with Trump. And they stress that this idea is in the early stages, but some of the people close to Trump's office think that it could actually play pretty well. And it's interesting. It's a very different approach, I would say, than what we probably would have expected under a Harris administration. But again, makes sense that they're going to piece something together specifically for, the new leader of the United States as he comes into office. There's been a lot of focus recently on the territorial control, how the lines might shift. In fact, one of Trump's supposed plans that was floated out there talked about freezing the line of contact where it is. And there was some pushback on that in a New York Times article where Ukrainian leaders said that's not actually the top priority. They said, with Ukrainian forces steadily losing ground in the east, two senior officials said that defending Ukraine's interests in potential talks would hinge not on territorial boundaries, which are likely to be determined by the fighting, but on what assurances are in place to make a ceasefire hold. Quote, talks should be based on guarantees, said Roman Kostenko, the chairman of the Ukrainian Parliament's Defense and Intelligence Committee. For Ukraine, nothing is more important. And another Ukrainian official, speaking on the condition of anonymity, seconded this, saying, quote, the territorial question is extremely important, but it's still the second question. The first question is security guarantees. And I think a lot of this ties in with, again, kind of the rumors that we're hearing, not from Trump himself, but from unnamed officials, supposedly close to his administration. So keep that in mind. In fact, I would argue that we don't really know exactly the direction Trump is going to go here. But the ones that we've seen leaked to this point do talk about essentially ceding portions of territory to Russia. And immediately there's pushback saying Ukraine would never allow that and they wouldn't permit that to stand. And here we have two officials saying, well, hold on, maybe. Let's take a look at what the security guarantees are before we immediately write anything off the table. Now, turning to some of the challenges that both of these countries are having as they try to press for some sort of advantage in this war, there's a great analysis put together by Darren Massicott, a Russia analyst. It'll be linked in the description below along with everything else that she just published yesterday following a research trip that she carried out in Ukraine. She said, quote, as officials and others have already said publicly, Ukraine is facing a shortage of manpower, infantry in particular. Mobilization has not brought relief for many reasons. Manpower and forced employment issues are challenges right now, and manpower is stretched across the front. A shortage of Western weapons was not the most critical issue during this particular snapshot in time, although it has been in the past. I thought that was really interesting because by and large, what we've heard for a couple of years now is the major challenge that Ukraine faces is shortage of weapons. We need to send more ammunition, more tanks, more Patriots, more everything. In this case, she's saying they're actually finding a pretty good way to utilize what they have. The challenge is trigger pullers, right? Actual infantry, people on the ground to be able to hold the front. She said the front has become unstable in a few areas. There are many factors complicating the Kursk operation in areas south of Pokrovsk. Kursk resupply and egress routes are limited and under threat. Russians know where the choke points are. Ground has been lost to Russian attacks, and the Russians seem to be trying to pinch this operation off at the neck. She adds that there have been multiple videos of Russians executing wounded or surrendering Ukrainian soldiers. The addition of DPRK soldiers in Kursk adds strain to an already strained situation there. And I've published a couple of these videos on Twitter in recent days, or Twitter or X. Unfortunately, we're seeing an increase in that of, in some cases, Russians are recording their executions of Ukrainian soldiers. In other cases, it appears to be a Ukrainian drone capturing that footage. But either way, there's definitely been an uptick in that recently, and it's frustrating, honestly, to see so little done about that on the world stage. It's just become so normal. We're so used to seeing it, which it's not normal. You should not expect that from any modern military, certainly not a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Now, Dara adds that Russians are launching frequent small attacks interspersed with armor assaults across the front, with concentrations against Kursk, Kupiansk, and areas south of Pokrovsk, as we mentioned earlier. All year, Russian forces have been modifying tactics towards encirclement instead of direct assaults. And I want to add a little caveat there, because what she's getting at is big picture, you're seeing more encirclements, but when you dial it into the actual tactical fight, these are still direct assaults. So you are still seeing small Russian forces, squad size, team or squad size. When I say team, we're talking about 5-ish soldiers, squad size, 10, maybe 15 soldiers. You have those small elements conducting direct assaults, but when you zoom out a little bit, you see more of an encirclement. She says Russians are using motorcycles, cars, carts, and armored vehicles to insert assault teams and strain defending units. Ukrainian forces use what they have to try to hold the assault back, using drones and an overall good supply of artillery shells to conserve manpower. Haven't heard that in quite a while, and there was actually a podcast on War on the Rocks with Michael Kaufman recently where he said the same thing. Said for the first time, maybe ever, it doesn't appear that Ukraine has a shortage of artillery rounds, which is interesting. It's hard to square that sometimes with the fact that we are seeing Russia advance faster than normal in a lot of areas. She says that Russia is taking its heaviest casualties since 2022 while on the offense. They continue to waste manpower and lose a great deal of equipment, but their rates of attack are not slowing. The Russians can rotate and regenerate forces better than Ukraine can right now. That's not really, the regeneration of forces isn't really a new dynamic here, right? From the opening days of the war, I mean, at the very, very beginning, you saw Ukraine have a surge in manpower compared with Russia. But really since then, that's been one of the major challenges that Ukraine has faced is Russia's ability to regenerate forces, rebuild their units, and push them back into the fight. She says on the current path, both Ukraine and Russia are headed for exhaustion in different ways. My concern is that Ukraine reaches it first if no changes are made. This is not for lack of bravery, competence, or skill of Ukrainian fighters, but a resource and strategy question. And she ends with something here that I felt like was worth sharing. I thought it was a great message. She said, finally and from the heart, I've held the hands of those fighting at the very edge of freedom. They're weary, focused, and good fighters, but they are bleeding out. They, despite all of it, are still kind and still brave. Changes are needed so they can defend what's theirs. Now, getting into the Russian losses that we've talked about a little bit here so far, in a Financial Times article, they quoted the UK defense chief saying that they estimate that Russian losses have been about 1,500 dead and injured every single day in October, with its overall casualties since February 2022 reaching 700,000. Look, the overall number, I'm always honestly, with numbers in general, I'm pretty skeptical when we're talking about casualties in this war. So if we move away from the numbers, I think maybe focus on the fact that they're talking about this being some of the deadliest time for Russian forces since the war began. And that matches with a lot of the footage that we're seeing coming out of the fight right now. We're seeing over and over and over again pretty significant Russian assaults. Again, squad, maybe platoon size at most. And by and large, we're seeing a lot of Russian casualties. And it matches with the idea that they're going on the offensive even more. In fact, Russian mill blogger Kasharova ranted about this about a week ago, saying, quote, "Life expectancy of an assault soldier on the front ranges from 2 weeks to a month. Just 2 years ago, an assault soldier was elite, top-notch specialists, fearless professionals. Today, an assault soldier is an untrained soldier who can barely shoot or in some cases is still recovering from injuries. Being sent into the assault is seen as a punishment or even presented as a humiliating position." He outlines 3 documented cases where a Russian soldier signed their military contract, was sent to the war zone, and was killed all inside 17 days. Now, look, when you're talking about 17 days from being a civilian to bleeding out somewhere in Ukraine, you can't talk about that person having any real military training. That is barely enough time when you factor in, getting them uniforms, filing the paperwork, actually transporting them to the front. You're talking about like a couple days at most to learn how to fire a weapon. It's cannon fodder is the only way to put that. 17 days. And anyways, he wraps up by arguing against this, saying this isn't the way to do it. He said it's a waste of government money, saying that the Russian government right now is spending between 6 and 12 million rubles. That's between $60,000 and $120,000 for essentially 2 weeks in uniform. So those are the death benefits. Saying we're paying out these pretty significant death benefits for somebody who goes into 1, maybe 2 assaults and dies 17 days after they sign their contract. That's not sustainable for anybody, any country around the world at all. And again, the reason that you're seeing troops moved into the front, moved into assault that fast is because losses are mounting. Something to keep in mind. Now, this is all kind of doom and gloom, I think, a little bit at this point. We're seeing a lot of pressure exerted by Russia at this point. Ukraine exerting their own pressure and trying to hold on in Kursk. But there is some news about what might be done in the coming weeks to try to give Ukraine an upper hand as they try to kind of have a better position at what might be a negotiating table here before too long. So Secretary of State Blinken just said that President Biden is committed to making sure that every dollar we have at our disposal will be pushed out the door between now and January 20th, saying that the administration plans to commit some $6 billion in aid for Ukraine in the next 2 months before President-elect Donald Trump takes office. This coming from a Pentagon spokesperson who said that roughly 2/3 of that aid, or $4 billion, will come in the form of presidential drawdown authority packages, weapons and equipment drawn from U.S. stockpiles, while the other 1/3, or $2 billion, will be procured as part of the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. Now, those security initiative packages can take a little bit longer as they represent new buys, like they're actually contracting for the equipment to be built. But the goal there, according to the Pentagon at this point, is to get those contracts signed with the idea that once they're in place and moving forward, they would be upheld during the next administration. Now, an item to consider here that is kind of falling between the cracks is if the plan right now is to send everything out the door to use up all of the funds allocated for Ukraine before Trump comes into office, that means by the time he assumes power in January, he won't have anything at his disposal to send. It'll kind of put him in a position right away of making the decision, is he going to continue supplying military aid to Ukraine or not? Like, that decision will need to be made immediately. In fact, not making that decision will essentially lead to a gap in any sort of military aid making its way to Ukraine, and no decision could be a decision, and it could stop all future shipments. It's something to consider. I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, right? It's forcing a decision point on day one when the war is complicated, the situation in Ukraine is complicated, and it the counter argument here is it might be good to give them a couple weeks to get up to speed and have briefings from defense, from intelligence, from state to get an idea of the best path forward. Whereas if everything is spent right away before he even comes into office, that decision point becomes that day. Just something to keep in mind. So, of course, we'll have to keep an eye on what happens on the battlefield here over the next couple weeks. I do expect the intensity of attacks to increase both by Ukraine and by Russia as both sides essentially prepare for what could be changes coming under the incoming Trump administration. But that's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.